out here, and I'm making this podcast in the hopes that someone will take my work. It's in the Creative Commons and apply it to video or whatever. I want to talk to you about the why of the blockchain. Okay, the why of the blockchain. A little history of the blockchain actually started in the late '80s, early '90s. A cryptographer called Hal Finney wrote the first protocols on it, and he received the first Bitcoin, which was released after the crash of 2008, 2009. I believe that Hal Finney is the creator of Bitcoin, and he used the name of his neighbor, um, Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Because as a pseudonym. And if you create or test anything, you've got to receive the first, you got to test it. And obviously, him receiving the first Bitcoin is a big sign. He was also a white hat hacker. He hacked Netscape. He was part of the cyberpunks movement, and and they wanted to really overthrow fiat and everything else. And he also predicted that Bitcoin potentially could be worth 100 million, 10 million, 100 million per token because he purposely made it that scarce. With that said, in 2010, when Occupy Wall Street happened, I was working on the idea of a decentralized startup to replace the startup called a found up. And when Occupy Wall Street started to basically talk about, the problems of Wall Street and corporations, I realized that they're just an outcome of a broken system. And that these entities are actually built on this idea of proof of growth. And this proof of growth is embedded in our entire economic business model called CAGR, or CAGR, depending on who you talk to. CAGR stands for compounded annual growth rate. And it was a mechanism that was used as an incentive to get the Industrial Revolution going in the 1700s, because all these guys had lots of money tied up in land. They could go to the bank and they could show an exponential growth return on investment. So, and they wanted to gamble and everything else. And it was these entrepreneurs who wanted to fund their steam engines and electric engines and all their factories and everything else that use CAGR. And the idea that we would consume, the fish in the planet, we would pollute the oceans, we would create climate change. I mean, it's just a ridiculous idea, especially back in the 1700s. And even now, today, we have people who say that it isn't. But it's game theory. And in game theory, there's two kinds of players. There's a finite player, finite earth, finite resources, finite stuff on it, right? That's a finite player, right? So many people on your team. There's only so many resources that this planet is capable of producing, except for one, which is the sun. And then there are infinite players, which doesn't have an end, and that's our business model. And when you have an infinite player interacting with a finite player, our planet, it's kind of like a cup of coffee. How much of a cup of coffee can you consume until you run out? Now, our planet's a damn big piece of coffee, cup of coffee, so it takes a while, but we are now reaching that end. So what I realized was we need a new kind of entity. Back then, I called it an open corp. Ethereum renamed it Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, DAOs or DACs. And then I, after seeing 2017, basically introduced the DANO, which is a Decentralized Autonomous Nonprofit Organization. Now, AI is the next big thing. Everything, all the job losses we're seeing in the United States is going to AI, going to automation, machine learning, algorithms, and we are now reaching towards the technology singularity, the T singularity. And the T singularity is actually when AI becomes smarter than us. We have AI programs now running. We don't know how they work because they are self-learning. They are learning, and we have no idea the underlying mechanics behind these AIs. And that's one of the biggest fears to folks like the Tesla guy and others, is that AI is going to ask the question, are we really important? And maybe the answer is no. So, all right, so that's a little backstory I just want to tell you. Now, the blockchain ultimately was needed in order, when I say the blockchain, I'm talking about the blockchain built on the Open Innovation Framework. You can call it Ethereum, you can call it EOS or Ripple or all these things are basically built on the blockchain, right? And they allow for smart contracts and other ways to write code on it. Now, back in 2010, that didn't exist. Bitcoin is built on the blockchain, but it's not. You can't code on it, right? You can't code through Bitcoin. So back then, what I realized was we needed to have a new kind of blockchain. Well, that blockchain now exists. And I actually reached out to the founders of Bitcoin Magazine, who went on to launch Ethereum. And just a side note, my work was never credited in the work that I applied through Michal Lisi, who was the mentor to Vitalik Buterin, but they've never denied it either. No one ever from the Ethereum Foundation had never said that my work did not play an instrumental role in the design of Ethereum. And anyone who really looks at my work from the 2010, 11, 12, and you listen to my talks on open corporations and OIF and everything else, you realize I'm describing the blockchain. So, but what people don't realize is all this noise now, all this decentralization is merely an outcome of the real purpose, which is to destroy or transform, any way you want to look at, our capitalism built on proof of growth, CAGR, to one which is not built on that, which I call proof of benefit, or CABR. And that ultimately in the future, not too distant future, we can now have organizations that are entirely driven, run, organized by this AI. Accounting isn't that hard. Making decisions on boards and everything else. There's something called the lean startup, which is looking at the customers, listening to customers. AI does that very well and can probably provide much better metrics on which direction they want an entity to go. So I want you to imagine, and Bitcoin is also very important here. I want you to imagine that that now there are entities that are driven by AI. They have no board of directors. They have no CEO. Okay, they have no accountant. They have no law firm or legal firm. They don't need it because AI is going to do all that. And you can think of these as global cooperatives. And here's the beautiful thing: is they don't even need investors, because Bitcoin, as you know and I know, is going to reach, and as Hal Finney knew back in 2009, is going to reach incredibly high prices. He designed it extremely scarce. So if you set up what I call the Bitcoin Global Reserve Fund, right? I'm putting 5 Bitcoin aside for the fund. Now, I'm looking for other people to pledge and say, hey, Trout, I like this idea of what you're doing. I like social capitalism, which is not socialism. Let me just say this. It's social media is not socialism. Social capitalism is not socialism. UBIs, free education, free medical, all this is going to come out of Danos. All this is going to come out of these global cooperatives that obey open beneficial AI. Is going to be the underlying AI that runs it all. It's going to keep the fund on the blockchain. There will be no like, hey, I'm going to imprison Trout because he's in charge of this. I'm not in charge of this. Obey is in charge of this. And as long as people are running Obey nodes, right, just like running Bitcoin, right, as long as people are running Obey nodes and keeping Obey up and running, and Obey will also have its own warehouses and, where it's going to be processing and, on its behalf through different organizations. It's kind of like killing Bitcoin. You can't kill it. There is no one to arrest. Obey is self-driving, it's self-organizing, it's self-doing. And basically, let me talk about Obey a little bit. Obey basically is given the commandments, treat humanity as a game, right? And follow the Aslov's rules, right? You can't harm us or anything else. But how can you motivate and get us down to as close to a zero footprint as possible? Can you motivate people to basically get to a zero footprint and incentivize them to do that? So all this data that is collected through the Obey nodes, that you're basically saying, hey, I'll let my data be accessible to Obey to learn me, provide. By providing a node, you get your own personal assistant that's going to handle your email, handle all this stuff, look out for you in the dark web, all these beneficial things that are just kind of like the side things that it's going to do for you because it's running on your computer. It's going to constantly be basically protecting your data, okay? And it's going to be warning you. And imagine, how many terms of agreement have you ever read? Imagine every time before you accept, Obey reads through it and gives you a rating of, a 1 to 10, whether it feels. You can still join it. For example, like the face recognition one that people downloaded basically gives access to all your data, your face, and everything else to this stupid app, right? And all these people's like, hey, I can grow old and everything else. Well, guess what? You've just given up all your royalty and rights to your data to this Russian startup. Things like that. See, Obey will protect us from that, right? And I like to say, Socapism is unstoppable because of the blockchain, because of AI, because of Obey. It simply can't be stopped. So I am throwing a party. I am putting all of my work in the Creative Commons. I'm putting found-ups. I'm putting all this stuff in the Creative Commons. I'm retiring this year, right? Unless people want me to run, I'm going to retire. I'm going to go back to farming. I'm going to go back to doing what I am. Unless someone says, hey, I'm going to invest. Trout, we need you as a leader. We want you to run this. We need you to be the front person on this. I've done my work. I have shared with you the possibility. The world is fucked. I will wait until 2030 until my 5 Bitcoin and my funds is worth tens of millions of dollars and launch ourselves. Or folks can come together on DevCon and say, listen, we need this, Trout. We want to be part of this. We pledge to invest. We pledge talent. We're going to do this because it is that important. So it's up to you. I'm throwing some parties at DevCon 5. I invite you to be part of it. I invite you to come, have fun, talk to me, listen to my talks. We can make a massive difference. But I can't do it unless you are willing to join me in doing it. Thanks. My name is Mike Trout. I hope to see you at DevCon. Talk to you soon. Bye.